안녕하세요. Today we are reading chapter 26. It's called The Story Club is Formed. 해보겠습니다. Junior Avonlea found it hard to settle down to humdrum existence again. To Anne in particular, things seemed fearfully flat, stale, and unprofitable after the goblet of excitement she had been sipping for weeks. Could she go back to the former quiet pleasures of those faraway days before the concert? At first, as she told Diana, she did not really think she could. 잘 들리는지 알려주시면, 안 들리면 좀 알려주세요. 네. I'm positively certain, Diana, that life can never be quite the same again as it was in those olden days, she said mournfully, as if referring to a period of at least 50 years back. 네. 레이첼님, 안녕하세요. 일찍 오셨습니다. 네. Alright, so humdrum existence. 너무 단조로운 삶으로 다시 돌아가야 되는데 너무 이게 힘들었다는 거죠. 왜냐하면 너무 콘서트 하면서 너무 신났기 때문에. 그래서 이제 나는 이제 그 시대로 전에 같은 삶으로 내가 돌아가기 어려울 것 같아. 그 돌아가는 시대가 50년 전인 마냥. Perhaps after a while I'll get used to it, but I'm afraid concerts spoil people for everyday life. 네, 일상적인 삶에 너무 망치게 만든다. 왜냐하면 그게 너무 신나니까 일상적인 삶은 너무 지루해지잖아요. I suppose that is why Marilla disapproves of them. Marilla is such a sensible woman. 너무 합리적인 분이야. It must be a great deal better to be sensible. But still, I don't believe I'd really want to be a sensible person because they're so unromantic. 너무 낭만적이지 못하잖아. Mrs. Lynde says there is no danger of my ever being one, but you can never tell. 나는 절대로 합리적인 사람 될 위험이 없으니까 걱정하지 말라 그러는데 하지만 절대로 모르는 거야. I feel just now that I may grow up to be sensible yet. But perhaps that is only because I'm tired. 내가 커서 되게 sensible 될 것 같아. 합리적이고 네, 합리적인 사람이 될 것 같아. But perhaps that is only because I'm tired. I simply couldn't sleep last night for ever so long. I just lay awake and imagined the concert over and over again. That's one splendid thing about such affairs. It's so lovely to look back to them. Eventually, however, Avonlea School slipped back into its old groove and took up its old interests. To be sure, the concert left traces. 콘서트가 있었다는 거를 증거들을 남겼다는 거죠. 왜? Ruby Gillis and Emma White, who had quarreled over a point of precedence in their platform seats, 누가 더 앞에 앉냐에 대해서 싸웠었죠. No longer sat at the same desk, and a promising friendship of 3 years was broken up. 3년 동안의 우정이 깨졌어요. Josie Pye and Julia Bell did not speak for 3 months because Josie Pye had told Bessie Wright that Julia Bell's bow when she got up to recite made her think of a chicken jerking its head, and Bessie told Julia. 네, 줄리아랑 조시가 되게 친한데 3개월 동안 말을 안 했어요. 왜? 조시가 베시에게 얘기했어요. 줄리아가 인사를 했을 때 뭐처럼 생각이 났다고? 뭐가 연상이 됐다고요? 닭이 고개를 팍 하잖아요. 빡빡빡빡 할 그게 연상이 됐다 그랬더니 그걸 또 베시가 일러가지고 이제 3개월 동안 말을 안 했다는 거죠. None of the Sloanes would have any dealings with the Bells because the Bells had declared that the Sloanes had too much to do in the program, and the Sloanes had retorted that the Bells were not capable of doing the little they had to do properly. 슬로운들은 벨들이랑 얘기를 안 했어요. 가족들과. 왜냐? 벨 가족이 슬로운 가족이 너무 혼자서 자기네들이 많은 것들을 했어요. 그 콘서트 때 자기네들만. 그랬더니 슬로운들이 뭐라 그랬어요? 벨들은 많이 줘도 제대로 하지도 못했을 거야. Finally, Charlie Sloane fought Moody Spurgeon McPherson because Moody Spurgeon had said that Anne Shirley put on airs about her recitations, and Moody Spurgeon was licked. Consequently, Moody Spurgeon's sister Ella May would not speak to Anne Shirley all the rest of the winter. 네. 무디가 뭐라 그랬었죠? Anne Shirley가 recitation 하는 거에 대해서 뽐낸다, put on airs, 뽐낸다고 했더니 Charlie Sloan이 licked, 두들겨 팼나 봐요. 왜 두들겨 팼을까요? Probably Charlie가 Anne을 좋아해서. 그래서 무리의 언니인지 동생인지 동생까지 Anne한테 얘기를 안 했다 그러죠. With the exception of these trifling frictions, work in Miss Stacy's little kingdom went on with regularity and smoothness. The winter weeks slipped by. It was an unusually mild winter with so little snow that Anne and Diana could go to school nearly every day by way of the birch path. On Anne's birthday, they were tripping lightly down it, keeping eyes and ears alert amid all their chatter, for Miss Stacy had told them that they must soon write a composition on a winter's walk in the woods, and it behooved them to be observant. 네, 뭐를 이제 글을 써야 되니까 이제 제대로 관찰을 하라고 그 숲을. Just think, Diana, I'm 13 years old today, remarked Anne in an awed voice. I can scarcely realize that I'm in my teens. When I woke this morning, it seemed to me that everything must be different. You've been 13 for a month, so I suppose it doesn't seem such a novelty to you as it does to me. 너는 한 달 동안 13살이었으니까 너에게는 그렇게 참신하고 새롭진 않겠지만 나에게처럼 참신하진 않겠지. It makes life seem so much more interesting. In 2 more years, I'll be really grown up. It's a great comfort to think that I'll be able to use big words then without being laughed at. 네, 왜 크고 싶나요? 큰 단어들, 긴 단어들을 써도 사람들이 웃지 않을 거니까. 네, 제이님 안녕하세요. Ruby Gillis says she means to have a beau as soon as she's 15, said Diana. Ruby Gillis thinks of nothing but beaux, said Anne disdainfully. 걔는 남자친구 사귈 생각밖에 안 해. She's actually delighted when anyone writes her name up in a take notice for all she pretends to be so mad. 화난 척 해도 누가 이렇게 루비의 이름과 다른 남자의 이름, 이게 둘이 서로 썸 타고 있다 뭐 이런 걸 쓰면 화난 척 해도 사실은 되게 기뻐하지. But I'm afraid that is an uncharitable speech. Uncharitable는 사람에 대한 판단이 뭘 인정한, 야박한. Mrs. Allen says we should never make uncharitable speeches, but they do slip out so often before you think, don't they? I simply can't talk about Josie Pye without making an uncharitable speech, so I never mention her at all. You may have noticed that. I'm trying to be as much like Mrs. Allen as I possibly can, for I think she's perfect. Mr. Allen thinks so too. Mrs. Lynde says he just worships the ground she treads on, and she doesn't really think it right for a minister to set his affections so much on a mortal being. But then, Diana, even ministers are human and have their besetting sins just like everybody else. I had such an interesting talk with Mrs. Allen about besetting sins last Sunday afternoon. There are just a few things that's proper to talk about on Sundays, and that is one of them. My besetting sin is imagining too much and forgetting my duties. 네, Anne의 습격하는 죄들이 뭐라고요? 네, 너무 상상을 많이 하고 자기의 직무들을 잊는 거. I'm striving very hard to overcome it, and now that I'm really 13, perhaps I'll get on better. In 4 more years, we'll be able to put our hair up, said Diana. Alice Bell is only 16 and she is wearing hers up, but I think that's ridiculous. I shall wait until I'm 17. 네, 앨리스는 머리를 이제 벌써 이렇게 올린대요. 그러니까 왜 이게 웃기대요? 16살밖에 안 됐는데 왜냐면 성인들만 머리를 그런 스타일로 했었나 봐요. If I had Alice Bell's crooked nose, said Anne decidedly, I wouldn't. But there, I won't say what I was going to because it was extremely uncharitable. 내가 앨리스의 crooked, 삐뚤어진 코가 있었더라면 나는 뭐뭐 안 했을 거야 했는데 말하다 말았어요. 너무 야박해서 말이. Besides, I was comparing it with my own nose, and that's vanity. I'm afraid I think too much about my nose ever since I heard that compliment about it long ago. It really is a great comfort to me. Oh, Diana, look, there's a rabbit. There's something to remember for our woods composition. I really think the woods are just as lovely in winter as in summer. They're so white and still, as if they were asleep and dreaming pretty dreams. I won't mind writing that composition when its time comes, sighed Diana. I can manage to write about the woods, but the one we're to hand in Monday is terrible. 내가 숲속에 대해서는 내가 쓰겠는데 이제 월요일에 제출해야 되는 건 정말 어려워. The idea of Miss Stacy telling us to write a story out of our own heads. 머릿속에 있는 이야기를 쓰라 그러다니. Why, it's as easy as wink, said Anne. 너무 쉬워. It's easy for you because you have an imagination, retorted Diana. 너는 상상력이 있으니까 쉽지. But what would you do if you'd been born without one? I suppose you have your composition all done. 넌 다 썼나 보지? Anne nodded, trying hard not to look virtuously complacent and failing miserably. 네, virtuously는 정숙하게, complacent는 자기만족적인. 그래서 되게 자만심을 갖고 자랑스러워서 자기는 다 썼기 때문에 그렇게 안 하려고 그런 표정을 안 하려고 했지만 failing miserably. 네, 완전히 실패했다는 거죠. I wrote it last Monday evening. It's called The Jealous Rival or In Death Not Divided. I read it to Marilla and she said it was stuff and nonsense. Then I read it to Matthew and he said it was fine. That is the kind of critic I like. 네, Marilla는 너무 말도 안 되는 말이라고. 이게 뭐냐고 이랬는데 Matthew는 정말 괜찮았다고. 나는 그런 비평가, 평론가를 좋아해. It's about two beautiful maidens called Cordelia Montmorency and Geraldine Seymour who lived in the same village and were devotedly attached to each other. Cordelia was a regal brunette with a coronet of midnight hair and duskly flashing eyes. Geraldine was a queenly blonde with hair like spun gold and velvety purple eyes. 네, Cordelia는 머리가 까맣고 Geraldine은 네, 금발머리였어요. 보라색 눈을 가지고. I never saw anybody with purple eyes, said Diana dubiously. Neither did I. I just imagined them. I wanted something out of the common. Geraldine had an alabaster brow, too. I found out what an alabaster brow is. That is one of the advantages of being 13. You know so much more than you did when you were only 12. Well, what became of Cordelia and Geraldine? Asked Diana, who was beginning to feel rather interested in their fate. 그들의 운명에 갑자기 조금 궁금해지기 시작했어요. 네, 감사합니다, 이승만님. All right. They grew in beauty side by side until they were 16. Then Bertram DeVere came to their native village and fell in love with the fair Geraldine. 네, fair는 되게 금색 머리 혹은 피부가 하얀 사람을 fair라고도 하죠. He saved her life when her horse ran away with her in a carriage, and she fainted in his arms, and he carried her home 3 miles because, you understand, the carriage was all smashed up. I found it rather hard to imagine the proposal because I had no experience to go by. 프로포즈를 나는 경험이 없어서 상상하는 데 어려움이 있어서 I asked Ruby Gillis if she knew anything about how men proposed because I thought she'd likely be an authority on the subject, having so many sisters married. 하도 언니들이 다 결혼을 해서 박사인 것 같아서 내가 물어봤지. Ruby told me she was hid in the hall pantry when Malcolm Andrews proposed to her sister Susan. 언니 수잔에게 Malcolm이 프로포즈할 때 숨어 있었대요. She said Malcolm told Susan that his dad had given him the farm in his own name, and then said, "What do you say, darling pet, if we get hitched this fall?" And Susan said, "Yes, no, I don't know. Let me see." And there they were, engaged as quick as that. But I didn't think that sort of a proposal was a very romantic one, so in the end I had to imagine it out as well as I could. I made it very flowery and poetical, and Bertram went on his knees, although Ruby Gillis says it isn't done nowadays. Geraldine accepted him in a speech a page long. I can tell you I took a lot of trouble with that speech. I rewrote it 5 times, and I look upon it as my masterpiece. 네, 프로포저를 얼만큼 길게 썼대요? 네, 한 페이지를 썼는데 5번이나 다시 썼대요. 그래서 자기의 이제 걸작이 됐대요. Bertram gave her a diamond ring and a ruby necklace and told her they would go to Europe for a wedding tour, for he was immensely wealthy. But then, alas, shadows began to darken over their path. Cordelia was secretly in love with Bertram herself, and when Geraldine told her about the engagement, she was simply furious, especially when she saw the necklace and the diamond ring. All her affection for Geraldine turned to bitter hate, and she vowed that she should never marry Bertram. 네, 친구가 갑자기 너무 자기도 Bertram을 사랑해서 이제 너무 싫어하기 시작했죠. But she pretended to be Geraldine's friend the same as ever. One evening, they were standing on the bridge over a rushing, turbulent stream, and Cordelia, thinking they were alone, pushed Geraldine over the brink with a wild, mocking, "Ha ha ha!" But Bertram saw it all, and he at once plunged into the current, exclaiming, "I will save thee, my peerless Geraldine!" But alas, he had forgotten he couldn't swim, and they were both drowned, clasped in each other's arms. Their bodies were washed ashore soon afterwards. They were buried in the one grave, and their funeral was most imposing, Diana. It's so much more romantic to end a story up with a funeral than a wedding. As for Cordelia, she went insane with remorse and was shut up in a lunatic asylum. I thought that was a poetical retribution for her crime. 네, 코르디엘리아가 혼자 있는 줄 알고 제럴딘을 물속에 빠뜨렸는데 버트럼이 보고 자기는 수영할 줄 모른다는 걸 잊고 뛰어들어갔어요. 그래서 둘 다 죽었다는 거죠. How perfectly lovely, sighed Diana, who belonged to Matthew's School of Critics. 네, belonged to Matthew's School of Critics. Matthew와 같은 비평가라는 거죠. I don't see how you can make up such thrilling things out of your own head, Anne. I wish my imagination was as good as yours. It would be if you'd only cultivate it. 재배만 한다면 너의 상상력도 좋아질 수 있어, said Anne cheeringly. I've just thought of a plan, Diana. Let you and I have a story club all our own and write stories for practice. 네, 여기서 이야기 클럽을 만들자는 거였어요. I'll help you along until you can do them by yourself. You ought to cultivate your imagination, you know. Miss Stacy says so. Only we must take the right way. I told her about the haunted wood, but she said we went the wrong way about it in that. This was how the story club came into existence. It was limited to Diana and Anne at first, but soon it was extended to include Jane Andrews and Ruby Gillis and one or two others who felt that their imaginations needed cultivating. 처음엔 다이아나와 앤만 있었는데 나중에는 상상력이 재배가 필요하다고 생각한 루비 앤드루스와 제인 앤드루스도 포함이 됐다는 거죠. No boys were allowed in it, although Ruby Gillis opined that their admission would make it more exciting, and each member had to produce one story a week. 일주일에 한 이야기씩 써야 됐어요. 네, 여기서 opined 이 단어가 opinion처럼 생겼죠. 그러니까 opinion은 의견인데 여기에 opined는 의견을 냈다라는 거죠. 동사. It's extremely interesting, Anne told Marilla. Each girl has to read her story out loud, and then we talk it over. We're going to keep them all sacredly and have them to read to our descendants. 우리 후손들에게 읽어줄 거예요. We each write under a nom de plume. 네, nom de plume은 필명이죠. 이거를 영어로는 nom de plume은 I think it's French. pen name이라고도 하고 pseudonym이라고도 합니다. Mine is Rosamond Montmorency. All the girls do pretty well. Ruby Gillis is rather sentimental. She puts too much lovemaking into her stories, and you know, too much is worse than too little. 사랑에 대해서만 너무 많이 있어요. 그리고 Jane never puts any because she says it makes her feel so silly when she has to read it out loud. Jane's stories are extremely sensible. Then Diana puts too many murder into hers. 네, 다이아나는 살인 사건들을 너무 많이 쓴대요. She says most of the time she doesn't know what to do with the people, so she kills them off to get rid of them. 네, 사람들을 어떻게 해야 할지를 이야기해서 어떻게 풀어야 될지 몰라서 그냥 죽게 한다는 거죠. I mostly always have to tell them what to write about, but that isn't hard, for I've millions of ideas. I think this story writing business is the foolishest yet, scoffed Marilla. 이 이야기 쓰는 거는 너가 가진 생각 중에 아주 제일 foolish한 것 같아. 네, 원래는 most foolish라고 해야 되는데 여기서 foolishest 이렇게 웃기게 말을 했죠. You'll get a pack of nonsense into your heads and waste time that should be put on your lessons. Reading stories is bad enough, but writing them is worse. 읽는 것도 안 좋은데 쓰는 건 더 나빠. 네, 우리 다이아나 너무 웃기죠. But we're so careful to put a moral into them all. Marilla explained Anne. 하지만 우리는 항상 이야기마다 도덕적인 교훈을 넣어요. I insist upon that. All the good people are rewarded and all the bad ones are suitably punished. I'm sure that must have a wholesome effect. The moral is the great thing. Mr. Allen says so. I read one of my stories to him, and Mrs. Allen and they both agreed that the moral was excellent. Only they laughed in the wrong places. 이상한 데에서 웃었어요. I like it better when people cry. 그러니까 웃지 않아. 슬퍼해야 될 때 웃고 웃어야 될 때 울었다는 건가요? 네, 울진 않았겠죠? 네. 아, 네, 알리샤님 지금이라도 들어오셔서 반갑습니다. I like it better when people cry. Jane and Ruby almost always cry when I come to the pathetic parts. 내가 슬픈 장면을 읽으면 항상 울어. Diana wrote her Aunt Josephine about our club, and her Aunt Josephine wrote back that we were to send her some of our stories. So we copied out 4 of our very best and sent them. Miss Josephine Barry wrote back that she had never read anything so amusing in her life. 네, amusing은 그냥 단지 재밌는 거가 아니라 웃긴다는 뜻도 포함이 돼 있어요. amusing. That kind of puzzled us because the stories were all very pathetic and almost everybody died. 왜 그렇게 재밌어 했는지 웃겨 했는지 모르겠어요. 다들 죽었는데. But I'm glad Miss Barry liked them. It shows our club is doing some good in the world. Mrs. Allen says that ought to be our object in everything. Object 여기서는 목표죠. I do really try to make it my object, but I forget so often when I'm having fun. I hope I shall be a little like Mrs. Allen when I grow up. Do you think there is any prospect of it, Marilla? 내가 커서 Mrs. Allen처럼 될 수 있는 희망이 있는 것 같아요? I shouldn't say there was a great deal, was Marilla's encouraging answer. 그렇게 희망적이진 않은 것 같아. Marilla의 격려적인 답이었습니다. 격려적이지 않는데 격려적이라고 했죠. 아, 네. Oh my goodness. 네. This is a long chapter today. 여러분, do you have any questions or comments so far? 네. How was your day, everybody? Okay. 네, 써주시면 네, 나중에 볼게요. I'm sure Mrs. Allen was never such a silly, forgetful little girl as you are. Mrs. Allen은 너처럼 까먹고 silly한 아이는 아니었을 거야. No, but she wasn't always so good as she is now either, said Anne seriously. She told me so herself. That is, she said she was a dreadful mischief when she was a girl and was always getting into scrapes. I felt so encouraged when I heard that. Is it very wicked of me, Marilla, to feel encouraged when I hear that other people have been bad and mischievous? 내가 다른 사람들이 어렸을 때 되게 나쁘고 장난꾸러기였다고 들었을 때 되게 격려받는 거가 정말 나쁜 일인가요? Mrs. Lynde says it is. Mrs. Lynde says she always feels shocked when she hears of anyone ever having been naughty, no matter how small they were. Mrs. Lynde says she once heard a minister confess that when he was a boy, he stole a strawberry tart out of his aunt's pantry, and she never had any respect for that minister again. Now, I wouldn't have felt that way. I'd have thought that it was real noble of him to confess it, and I'd have thought what an encouraging thing it would be for small boys nowadays who do naughty things and are sorry for them to know that perhaps they may grow up to be ministers in spite of it. 저는 다른 사람들이 어렸을 때 나쁜 짓을 했다고 들으면 정말 격려적이에요. 왜냐하면 커가지고 또 그렇게 나쁜 짓을 했는데도 불구하고 커서 목사가 됐으니까. That's how I'd feel, Marilla. The way I feel at present, Anne, said Marilla, is that it's high time you had those dishes washed. 내가 느끼기에는 이제 설거지를 이제 빨리 할 시간이 된 것 같아. You've taken half an hour longer than you should with all your chattering. 30분이나 더 걸렸어. 하도 떠들어서. Learn to work first and talk afterwards. 일 먼저 하고 나중에 말하는 거를 좀 배우렴. Good. The end. All right. How did you guys like this chapter? 네. It was not a very exciting chapter, but 우리 얘네들이 얼마나 아직 어려서 이야기들을 썼을 때 얼마나 웃긴 이야기인지 몰라서 사람들이 왜 웃는지 모르는 이렇게 너무 so young and innocent 하다는 걸 느낄 수 있죠. All right. How did you guys enjoy this chapter? 1부터. All right, everybody. 격려적이라는 말. Encouraging. 그렇죠. 남이 안 좋은 일 얘기를 들으면 나쁜 짓을 한 거를 들으면 되게 격려적이라니까. 네, so next week is chapter 27, Vanity and Vexation of Spirit. Oh, that's a kind of a long chapter as well. I will see you again next week. Thank you for coming. Good night.